So I really like the pop artists. I would go to see all these exhibitions, and then one day I had a day off in New York, and I went to the Museum of Modern Art, and there was an exhibition by a bloke called Joseph Cornell, who I'd never heard of. And so, yeah, I paid my $15 and I went in, and it was like that St. Paul on the road to Damascus moment. It was like, wow, you know, there was the grand gesture was replaced by these tiny little display cabinets that were like the weirdest thing I'd ever seen, but really mysterious and beautiful. And I'd never used that word, beauty, ever. You weren't allowed to use that in art college with conceptualism and all that kind of stuff. But they were just tremendous. Joseph Cornell was born in 1898 and died in 1960 something, I think. Don't quote me. And he was basically a recluse. He lived in Long Island. Right. He worked in New York, but he would go beachcombing and pick up all these things, you know, that got washed up from the beach. And he would go around all the second-hand stores in New York and pick up a lot of musical scores and theatre programmes and that sort of stuff. And he made collages and these extraordinary display cabinets, for want of a better word, they're not big. They're only about, and they're absolutely fantastic. And I was absolutely blown away. And it really changed the way that I looked at art.
Yeah. Well, just size-wise, I imagine you're looking at sort of wall size.
Well, yeah.
Those are huge.
Yeah, there was no. I just thought, wow, if you know, art's got to be huge and grand and make the grand gesture. But actually, I didn't. You know, it doesn't. It's just got to. Again, it's a good idea.
Yeah.
You know, like what I said about the two-tone. It's you know, and I just thought, and that really sort of changed how I looked at art. So I made a few of those, but you know, just. That was quite some time ago. They haven't. Then when I quit the specials, I eventually ended up as a teacher. I trained as a primary school teacher, but ended up working as a special. I was the art department in a special needs school, right. Which again was really different because you had to kind of sell the subject almost, and so you could do Matisse's cutouts. You know, because, you know, anybody, you know, not anybody can do it, but, you know, you could, hey, this is what a real artist does. You can do something that's like that. Oh, yes, there I am. Yeah. It was, I tell everyone it was the second best job I ever had. It was good fun. And once a month, this amount of money would appear in my bank account, which, having been self-employed for ever, was like, wow, this was still, I did it for 10 years, and I was still amazed that every week, every month, somebody would pay me.
I've just done the opposite. I've just moved from a steady wage into mystery. We can talk about your influences, but you've already mentioned that. But on the phone, when we spoke, you talked something about quite interesting when you sort of talked about how pop artists created a similar rupture to punk, and you found that sort of thing interesting.
Yes, it's like the abstract expressionists. I mean, Barnett, Newman. You know, I've got a book at home called Understanding Barnett Newman. It's impenetrable. It's all about Greek mythology, and Rothko will go on about the desolation of existential experience. You know, and it's like, what the fuck is that? You know, and then all of a sudden, Andy Warhol comes along with a soup can. Yeah. Andy Warhol was a graphic designer. He was an illustrator for the New Yorker and that sort of stuff in the 50s and 60s. So he'd draw a real good picture of a pair of shoes, you know, for an advert. And I think Peter Blake, who's another one of my great influences. I love Sir Peter Blake. I mean, he was trained as a graphic designer, but then was accepted on a fine art course at the Royal College. So
he's got that rock and pop.
Yeah,
well.
But what was the question?
We were talking about the punk and the pop art.
Okay. So you had all this philosophical stuff all about the explanation for these paintings, and along comes Andy Warhol with his soup can and just blows that out the water. Yeah. And that really reminded me of, like, in music, when sort of in 1974, 75, you know, you had to, you know, the Yes reduced a triple album, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and that sort of stuff, and along comes the Sex Pistols and the Clash and just blew those bands out the water, like Nirvana did with, like, you know, heavy metal. Really, it just destroyed that completely and just started again. And I think, you know, but that happened in art, you know, whereas You know, no, we're not going to talk about the existentialism of the human condition. Look, here's a soup can, you know.
Yeah.
It was brilliant.
I guess sometimes it's what history chooses to look at, isn't it? 'Cause with music, it was. I mean, it's wizards' capes, wasn't it? As far as when you look back at the 70s, apart from people like maybe Mark Bolan and maybe David Bowie did something.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned David Bowie. Yeah.
Yeah.
He could carry off wearing a dress, whereas Mott the Hoople didn't look too good in platform shoes.
No, they didn't.
Is this going over everyone's head? I'm sorry. I really don't want to. You know, we're having fun. I don't know.
Check out Mud. You know.
Are you with us? Yeah. Okay.
Any questions yet?
Yeah. I've got time. Can't get a word.
But yes, but there's always some things that sort of. Mott the Hoople's a good example. They did have a kind of sort of a punky kind of feel before punk in a way.
They were fantastic.
Yeah.
Mick Jones was, so we said, when he was big influence was Mott the Hoople.
Yeah.
First ever band that I supported when I was sort of 16
Really?
was Mott the Hoople. Wellingborough.
Yeah, I remember you saying
in Wellingborough.
Yeah.
We were awful, but you know, hey, I could dine out on
Yeah.
saying that I'd played with Mott the Hoople.
Fantastic. I think we should start. If we can start looking at some of your work. I mean, you've separated into certain series. Actually, we stop there.
This is
Tony.
Peter
That's
Blake.
a great one.
That's Peter Blake and his 1961, 62 self-portrait with badges. And I was asked to contribute to an exhibition called I Love You Because, to commemorate 60 years of Elvis recording that particular song. And I'm not a great Elvis fan, to be honest. I like the rock and roll stuff, the rockabilly stuff is great, but I'm a great Peter Blake fan. And on that portrait, he's got this magazine with a picture of Elvis on it. So I just kind of fucked around with that a bit and put Elvis on Peter Blake, and then so he's holding a.
Yeah.
And the badges are like. There's black flag, you know. There's stuff that like, you know, that wouldn't appear in 1960, like the CND. There's black flag. There's a Madness badge. There's a Clash badge, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I'm kind of pleased with that one. It's quite funny.
I like I mean, there's quite a few. I was looking at.
One day I'll be able to make half as well as Peter Blake. You know?
You say that sometimes. I've watched you online. And you sort of you're quite humble the way you talk about your work. But I think something really stands out. I love the icons, especially, you know, the people. I don't know where you've taken pictures, whether they're from photographs. You know, you've got people sort of vendors, and you talk to me about elevating the ordinary and stuff like that.
Well, that was the great thing about pop art. You know, you take a soup can and you make it into art.
Yeah.
You know, you elevate the mundane. And I really like the idea of practical art, if you know what I mean. I like. And a good example of that is like the traditional religious icon. You want to go from Moscow to Novgorod and not get eaten by a bear, take a picture with you. You know, do you know what I mean? You want the crops to grow good this year? Okay, get some coffee beans and do a drawing in the ground. You know, that's practical art, yeah? So this idea of, that's where I get my thing about icons. And I love the way that in traditional iconography, all the rules of art are just thrown out the window. There's no light or shade. The whole perspective thing is like, and the most important figure is generally the Christ figure, who is in, you know, despite the fact there might be somebody in front of him, they're going to be smaller. Yeah. You know, which flies in the face of all sort of composition. So a lot of these, what I call icons, the figure is in the centre. There's probably no or very little shade in it, and then they're just sort of painted with that reverence. And also there's a thing in iconography. There's always a border around the outside, which is sometimes raised and sometimes not, and that's to separate the image from the mundane world. And it's that word mundane, which is really cool. I was asked by the Amy Winehouse Foundation to do a picture for there was an exhibition to commemorate what would have been her 30th birthday. Amy Winehouse was a big Specials fan. We played.
Right,
This is weird. We were in Chelmsford. We did the V Festival. And Terry, the singer, would go off stage while Roddy, the guitar player, would sing Concrete Jungle. So he's off stage, and Amy Winehouse is at the festival. So she comes up and goes, Terry, can I come on? Terry, can I come on? Can I do Monkey Man? We've done Monkey Man. Can I come on? Can we do You Wondering Now? And Terry's like, all right then. So he comes back on stage.
Just
and,
impromptu, yeah.
and towards the end of the show, Terry goes, well, OK, now we're going to be joined by our friend Amy, and and the rest of us were on stage. So I turned around and said, what? and this creature, you know, skinny little creature waddled, and I'm like, shit. You know, is she going to be totally out of her head, you know, or completely or whatever? But she was great. And she sang fabulously. She did You're Wondering Now, and then stayed on for Ghost Town. But that's the only time. That's my Amy Winehouse story. Okay,
it's a good one.
Yeah, but then I was asked to do this picture, which was based on a photo session, a Fred Perry photo session. And the photo was taken by Brian Adams. You know, the rock.
Yeah.
Who's now become a photographer. And I wanted to make it so that she didn't. I looked on the internet for images to base and then they were all of her staggering out of nightclubs with like cocaine still stuck in her nose and scratches where she's had a fight with what's his name, and her eyes were crossed because she was totally out of her head, and I didn't like the fact that was how she would be remembered
and portrayed
as like this car crash, you know. And so I kind of put her in this kind of Henri Rousseau kind of fantasy setting.
Similar to the robots, your robots are on the beach, aren't they?
Yes. like a robot would
taking
be,
time out.
Yeah.
And with some of the, I don't know if you go back, Tony, to the guy with the trombone. Yeah. These pictures, are they from photographs that you've taken?
Yeah, they're based on photographs, yeah. A mate of mine, the original of that was actually in the Sunday Times a couple of 3 weeks back. Jason Scott Tilley is a photographer, lives in Coventry, and he spends a lot of time in India. And he came up with this one, and okay, excuse me, I think he would look great. So yeah. No, they're great, they're really great.
Moving on, quite different from the iconography. You've done some work with the. Just have a look at a couple of these.